The Meridian Combat Institute floated in the void like a monument to galactic civilization's most cherished delusion, that intelligence and sophistication could somehow transform the brutal necessity of warfare into something resembling performance art. Deep Space Platform Echo 7 represented 3,000 years of evolutionary refinement, housing species who had transcended their primitive violent impulses and developed what they called elevated martial philosophy. The irony, of course, was that these same enlightened beings still needed to learn how to kill each other efficiently, which created the sort of cognitive dissonance that kept the galaxy's therapists in business. Professor Axiom Stardust glided into the combat theory amphitheater with the ethereal grace of someone whose species had evolved past the inconvenience of actually having bones. His crystalline form caught the ambient lighting in ways that suggested his ancestors had been designed by committee, with input from both philosophers and interior decorators. The assembled cadets represented the finest military minds from 17 different star systems, each convinced that their particular approach to organized violence represented the pinnacle of civilized warfare. Today, Professor Stardust announced, his voice carrying harmonics that made nearby crystal formations resonate sympathetically, we explore the seventh principle of harmonic combat theory, the integration of spiritual transcendence with tactical application. In the back row, Cadet Raven Blackwood listened to this pronouncement with the expression of someone watching a cooking show where the chef insisted on discussing the philosophical implications of each ingredient. Humans had been attending the Institute for exactly 6 standard cycles, long enough for the other species to develop what they diplomatically called appreciation for Terran directness and what Raven privately thought of as barely concealed terror at our complete lack of pretension. The lecture hall buzzed with the kind of intellectual energy typically found in graduate seminars on theoretical physics or advanced interpretive dance. Cadet Moonwhisper of the Gossamer Collective took notes with appendages that looked like they'd been designed for calligraphy rather than combat. Next to her, Cadet Prism the Contemplative nodded along to concepts that would have made ancient Zen masters weep with confusion. And there, in the front row with the bearing of someone attending a religious ceremony, sat Cadet Luxor Windweaver. If the Institute had an unofficial mascot for everything absurd about galactic combat doctrine, Luxor would be featured on motivational posters with captions like "Elegance through adversity" and "Spiritual growth via organized violence." His species, the Celestians, had spent the last millennium developing a combat methodology that treated warfare like a particularly aggressive form of meditation, complete with breathing techniques, philosophical frameworks, and enough ritual to make a diplomatic wedding look spontaneous. Standing nearly 9 feet tall with the kind of otherworldly beauty that suggested his people had bred specifically to model for cosmic fashion magazines, Luxor approached combat with the reverence most beings reserved for religious enlightenment. Every movement was deliberate, every gesture laden with symbolic meaning, every technique part of an elaborate philosophical system that turned simple violence into something resembling interpretive theology. The essence of Celestian combat philosophy, Professor Stardust continued, consulting holographic notes that shimmered with academic authority, lies in the understanding that physical conflict represents the external manifestation of internal spiritual development. Each engagement becomes an opportunity for transcendental growth. Raven suppressed the urge to raise her hand and ask whether transcendental growth helped when someone was trying to cave in your skull with a plasma rifle, but she'd learned that such questions tended to result in lengthy discussions about the limitations of primitive thinking and the importance of evolutionary perspective. The other students absorbed this information like gospel truth. They'd spent their entire lives in civilizations that had transformed every aspect of existence into elaborate intellectual exercises, from food preparation to mating rituals to interstellar diplomacy. The idea that combat might be anything other than a sophisticated art form was as foreign to them as the concept of gravity to a species that had never experienced planetary surfaces. Today's practical application, Professor Stardust announced, will focus on the Celestian technique of harmonic engagement. Cadet Windweaver will demonstrate the traditional opening sequence. A collective murmur of appreciation rippled through the assembled students. Luxor's demonstrations were legendary at the Institute, combining technical precision with the kind of aesthetic beauty that made combat look like choreographed dance performed by beings who had transcended the mundane limitations of physics. Partner assignments, the professor continued, consulting his holographic display, have been calculated using the new cultural compatibility algorithm designed to maximize learning opportunities while minimizing. The pairing system represented the cutting edge of bureaucratic overthinking, taking into account species psychology, cultural frameworks, combat philosophies, and approximately 63 other variables that somehow managed to completely ignore the most important factor, whether putting these particular beings in the same space might result in what humans would classify as an educational experience. Cadet Blackwood, Professor Stardust announced, you will demonstrate Terran combat applications with Cadet Windweaver. The amphitheater fell silent with the kind of hushed anticipation typically reserved for natural disasters and tax audits. Even the ambient lighting seemed to dim slightly, as if the station's AI had developed a sense of dramatic timing. Raven looked across the training space at Luxor, who was currently engaged in what appeared to be a preparation ritual involving slow, graceful movements and the sort of deep breathing that suggested he was either preparing for combat or attempting to achieve a state of cosmic consciousness, possibly both. "This should be interesting," she muttered. The demonstration area had been designed with the same aesthetic sensibility as the rest of the institute. Flowing lines, soft atmospheric lighting, and absolutely nothing that might suggest the messy reality of actual violence. The combat surface itself appeared to be constructed from some kind of responsive material that probably cost more than most planets' annual military budgets, surrounded by monitoring equipment sophisticated enough to analyze the philosophical implications of a misplaced footstep. Luxor approached the center of the space with the fluid grace of someone who had never encountered anything more dangerous than a negative performance review. He began the traditional Celestian pre-engagement sequence, a series of flowing movements that looked like a combination of advanced yoga and contemporary dance, complete with symbolic gestures representing the harmony between opposing forces and the spiritual significance of controlled conflict. The Celestian approach, he explained in that cultured accent that made everything sound like wine-tasting notes, emphasizes the sacred nature of combat as a pathway to enlightenment. Each technique flows naturally from philosophical understanding, creating a dialogue between participants that transcends mere physical confrontation. Raven watched this performance with the expression of someone trying to determine whether they were witnessing art or elaborate performance therapy. "Right, and how does that work out when someone's shooting at you?" "We prefer to conceptualize such encounters as opportunities for accelerated spiritual development," Luxor replied, apparently interpreting her question as genuine philosophical inquiry rather than pointed criticism. "Violence without meaning is merely destruction. Combat without growth is merely brutality." And what happens when the other guy doesn't share your philosophical framework? Then they have not yet achieved the necessary level of evolutionary sophistication to appreciate the deeper implications of conflict resolution. Raven blinked. "You realize that's basically natural selection with extra steps, right?" The preparation ritual continued for several more minutes, during which Luxor demonstrated approximately 15 different traditional stances, each with its own historical significance, symbolic meaning, and aesthetic properties. Raven used this time to stretch her shoulders and wonder whether the Institute's medical facilities were prepared for what she was increasingly certain would be classified as cross-cultural education through applied physics. The other students watched with the rapt attention of beings witnessing high art. Professor Stardust provided commentary that transformed each movement into a dissertation on the philosophical underpinnings of advanced combat theory, complete with references to ancient texts and theoretical frameworks that had probably never encountered actual violence. Finally, mercifully, the ceremonial preparations concluded. Luxor assumed what appeared to be his species' version of a ready position, which resembled something between a meditation pose and a fashion magazine photo shoot. "The Celestian tradition," he announced with the gravity typically reserved for religious proclamations, "begins with the palm of recognition, a ceremonial gesture that acknowledges the sacred nature of our engagement and establishes the spiritual framework for meaningful conflict." What happened next would eventually be documented in 47 different incident reports, 6 formal investigations, 2 diplomatic inquiries, and 1 hastily rewritten section of the Institute's emergency response protocols. Luxor's palm of recognition consisted of a ritualistic open-handed strike delivered to his opponent's face with all the ceremonial significance of a religious blessing and approximately the same amount of force as a gentle pat of encouragement. In Celestian culture, this gesture represented the acknowledgement of mutual respect, the acceptance of conflict as spiritual necessity, and the commitment to engage in combat as a pathway to transcendental understanding. In human culture, it represented getting slapped in the face by someone who clearly didn't understand the concept of personal space. Raven's response was immediate, instinctive, and informed by approximately 2 million years of evolutionary programming that had never encountered the concept of ceremonial violence and wasn't particularly interested in learning about it at the moment. Her right hand shot forward, caught Luxor's extended wrist in a grip that suggested she understood leverage in ways that didn't require philosophical justification, and in one fluid motion that contained absolutely no spiritual significance whatsoever, she stepped inside his reach, pivoted on her left foot, and applied what her old instructor would have called basic joint manipulation, and what the Institute's medical staff would later classify as comprehensive structural readjustment. The sound of Luxor's elbow joint hyperextending echoed through the amphitheater like a tree branch deciding to explore new approaches to basic physics. This was immediately followed by a vocalization that Celestian vocal cords apparently produced when experiencing what their medical literature would diplomatically describe as unexpected anatomical reconfiguration. Luxor collapsed onto the responsive combat surface with all the grace of a collection of expensive wind chimes encountering a hurricane. His arm remained extended at an angle that suggested his elbow had suddenly developed an interest in abstract sculpture and decided to become a living example of the genre. The amphitheater fell silent except for the gentle humming of life support systems and what sounded like Luxor attempting to process several complex philosophical concepts simultaneously while his nervous system dealt with the discovery that his arm was now resembling a particularly avant-garde piece of kinetic art. Raven stood over him, still maintaining her grip on his wrist, looking down with the clinical detachment of someone who had just observed an interesting demonstration of applied physics. "Huh," she said, with the tone of someone making a casual observation about the weather. "Looks like your spiritual framework has some structural limitations." The assembled students stared with the kind of shocked silence typically reserved for natural disasters and final exam results. Professor Stardust's crystalline form had developed what could charitably be described as an alarmed flicker. "Cadet Blackwood," the professor said, his harmonics carrying the careful modulation of someone trying to maintain academic composure while witnessing something that would require extensive documentation. "Perhaps you could explain your interpretation of the exercise." Raven looked around the amphitheater, taking in the expressions of shock, horror, and what appeared to be morbid fascination. "He slapped me. I slapped back. Physics took over from there. But the palm of recognition is a sacred ritual that, look, I don't know what planet you're from, but where I come from, when somebody hits you in the face, the appropriate response isn't philosophical contemplation. It's making sure they don't get the chance to do it again." Luxor, meanwhile, was attempting to achieve a sitting position while cradling his newly redesigned appendage. His face had acquired the pale, shocked expression of someone whose entire worldview was undergoing rapid and uncomfortable revision. "I was following established protocol," he managed to articulate, his voice carrying the bewildered tone of someone who had just discovered that the universe might not operate according to the theoretical frameworks he'd spent his entire life studying. "Yeah, well, congratulations, you just got a practical lesson in the difference between theory and application." The Institute's medical complex represented the pinnacle of galactic healthcare technology, staffed by beings whose species had evolved past most forms of physical vulnerability and who approached medicine with the same theoretical detachment they brought to everything else. Chief Medical Officer Dr. Harmony Lightweaver examined Luxor's elbow with the fascination of someone discovering a new form of performance art. "Extraordinary," she murmured, manipulating the joint with appendages that appeared to have been designed for conducting symphony orchestras rather than treating trauma injuries. "I've never encountered hyperextension patterns quite like this. The human appears to have identified leverage points that our combat simulation models never accounted for." Luxor reclined on the examination platform, resembling someone who had just received a very expensive education in practical applications of biomechanics. His arm was now encased in what appeared to be a regenerative medical apparatus that hummed with the kind of advanced technology that could rebuild tissue at the molecular level, but apparently couldn't prevent someone from getting their joint architecture redesigned by a species that still used kinetic projectile weapons. "Will I regain full functionality?" he inquired, his voice carrying the careful politeness of someone trying very hard not to contemplate the broader implications of his situation. "Absolutely," Dr. Lightweaver assured him, "though I suspect you may wish to reconsider your approach to interspecies combat methodologies. The human's response suggests that your species' traditional techniques may not be optimally suited for encounters with beings who conceptualize combat as survival necessity rather than spiritual exercise." Outside the medical complex, a gathering of curious students had assembled to discuss what was already being referred to as the incident, in the kind of hushed tones that suggested they were witnessing the birth of institutional legend. "Did you observe the speed of her reaction?" Moonwhisper was saying, her gossamer appendages fluttering with what appeared to be excitement. "It was as if she bypassed conscious decision-making entirely. That's precisely what makes it so unsettling," Prism added, his contemplative bearing suggesting he was already developing philosophical frameworks to explain what he'd witnessed. "Humans appear to possess combat reflexes that operate independently of cognitive processing. It's like they've evolved weaponized muscle memory." Meanwhile, in the Institute's administrative complex, a cascade of urgent communications was being transmitted to various governmental bodies, military commands, and what appeared to be several insurance carriers. The incident had raised questions that no one had previously considered necessary to ask, such as whether the Institute's liability coverage extended to intercultural combat misunderstandings, and whether there existed diplomatic protocols for apologizing to an entire species for accidentally discovering that their traditional combat techniques were, from a practical perspective, roughly equivalent to painting targets on their own anatomy. Institute Director Cosmic Starweaver, whose species had evolved from something resembling a cross between a philosopher and an extremely large butterfly, reviewed the incident documentation with the expression of someone attempting to solve a mathematical equation that kept producing results like humans are terrifying, and maybe we should reconsider our entire approach to military education. So, he said, addressing the assembled faculty, we have a human cadet who responded to a traditional Celestian greeting by nearly reconstructing her opponent's skeletal architecture. The Celestian cadet is recovering, and appears to be experiencing what our psychological staff describes as accelerated worldview recalibration. And we have approximately 400 other cadets who are now viewing humans with what our anthropological consultants are calling respectful terror, disguised as academic interest. The faculty exchanged glances that suggested they were all contemplating the same conclusion, but none of them wanted to be the first to articulate it publicly.
Perhaps, suggested Dr.
Philosophy Moonbeam from the Department of Interspecies Cultural Studies, we should consider implementing species-specific combat curricula.
You mean segregated training?
Director Starweaver inquired. I prefer to characterize it as culturally responsive educational customization, Dr. Moonbeam replied. The humans appear to approach combat from a fundamentally different paradigmatic framework than our other student populations, which was, everyone realized, an academically elegant way of saying that humans fought like they intended to win, while everyone else fought like they were auditioning for a very violent ballet company. The solution, when it emerged, was both elegant and profoundly ironic. Rather than segregating the humans, the Institute decided to integrate what they were now calling Terran combat pragmatism as a core component of their educational methodology. If the galaxy's military forces were going to encounter species that approached warfare as existential necessity rather than philosophical exercise, they needed to understand how such beings operated. Raven found herself elevated from cadet to Director of Applied Combat Reality, a position that apparently involved teaching alien military officers how to fight, as if their continued existence depended on the outcome. Her inaugural course, Human Combat Methodologies, Theory versus Practice, achieved maximum enrollment within minutes of being announced. The fundamental concept you need to understand, she explained to a classroom full of beings who had spent their entire lives approaching combat like an extremely violent form of chess, is that humans don't fight with honor, we fight to survive. There's no aesthetic merit in losing, no spiritual growth in getting killed, and no philosophical value in having your anatomy redesigned by someone who thinks your traditional combat techniques are charming. The students documented her observations with the desperate intensity of beings who had suddenly realized that their entire understanding of warfare might possess certain practical limitations. Luxor, meanwhile, had achieved something resembling celebrity status in his own right. His encounter with what the Institute was now officially classifying as applied Terran combat principles had provided him with unique insights into the differences between theoretical and practical approaches to conflict resolution. He began offering his own seminars, Surviving Human Interaction, a practical guide, which focused on recognizing when elegant traditional techniques were about to encounter the immovable object of human pragmatism. The traditional Celestian palm of recognition, he explained to audiences of fellow cadets who hung on his every word, assumes that your opponent shares your cultural understanding of appropriate combat etiquette. This assumption, as I discovered through direct empirical experience, can result in what medical personnel classify as educational joint restructuring. The Institute's revised approach to combat education proved remarkably effective. Students who had previously approached warfare like an extremely violent form of interpretive dance began to comprehend concepts like situational awareness, tactical adaptation, and the importance of not telegraphing your intentions to someone who might respond by redesigning your skeletal architecture. 1 year after the incident, the Meridian Combat Institute had been restructured to accommodate what the administration diplomatically referred to as diverse combat philosophies. The elegant, aesthetically pleasing training facilities had been supplemented with equipment that looked suspiciously like it had been designed by someone who understood that actual combat typically involved significantly more chaos and significantly less choreography than traditional galactic military theory suggested. Raven stood before her latest class, observing a mixed group of alien cadets practicing what she had designated survival response techniques. The curriculum included such revolutionary concepts as neutralize threats immediately, there's no such thing as unfair tactics when someone's trying to kill you, and style points don't matter if you're dead. Remember, she told her students, the objective isn't to look impressive or honor tradition, the objective is to return home alive. Everything else is just aesthetic preference. At the back of the classroom, Luxor observed the lesson with the expression of someone who had acquired wisdom through what philosophers might call direct empirical experience, and what everyone else would call getting his elbow hyperextended by someone who hadn't read the cultural sensitivity manual. His arm had healed completely, Thanks to the Institute's advanced medical technology, his perspective, however, remained permanently transformed. He had discovered that the universe contained beings who approached conflict with the same level of ceremonial respect that most species reserved for routine maintenance tasks, and this knowledge had provided him with insights that his instructors found both valuable and mildly disturbing. As the class concluded and students began departing, discussing the finer points of what they had just learned with the enthusiasm of beings who had discovered that the universe was far more interesting and dangerous than they had previously imagined, Raven reflected on the cosmic irony of her situation. Here she was, a human from a species that most of the galaxy considered barely evolved past throwing rocks at each other, instructing the representatives of ancient, sophisticated civilizations in the fundamentals of effective combat. The beings who had mastered faster-than-light travel and quantum mechanics were taking notes on basic self-defense techniques from someone whose species had only recently figured out how to leave their home system without accidentally blowing themselves up. The Institute's official evaluations would eventually conclude that the integration of Terran combat methodologies into the standard curriculum had resulted in a 423% improvement in combat effectiveness among graduating officers, a 76% reduction in casualties during first contact situations with aggressive species, and what the psychological assessment team described as a beneficial recalibration of expectations regarding the nature of interstellar conflict. Unofficially, everyone agreed that the humans had taught them something that 3 millennia of civilized evolution had somehow overlooked. Sometimes the most sophisticated solution to a problem was the one that actually worked. Luxor approached Raven as she gathered her instructional materials, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who had learned to be very conscious of his personal space around humans. "I wanted to express my gratitude," he said, his cultured accent carrying a warmth that hadn't been present during their first encounter, "for hyperextending your elbow, for demonstrating that there's a fundamental difference between fighting beautifully and fighting effectively. My people spent so long perfecting the aesthetics of combat that we forgot the underlying purpose of the exercise." Raven regarded him, seeing not the pretentious academic she had encountered a year ago, but someone who had gained genuine understanding through what was probably the most educational beating in galactic history. "You know," she said, "maybe that's the real lesson here. It's not that humans are superior fighters. It's that we never forgot that combat isn't supposed to be performance art. It's supposed to keep you breathing." As they walked toward the exit, Raven couldn't help but appreciate the thought that somewhere in the galaxy, there were probably beings who were grateful that their military officers had learned effective combat techniques from a species that still considered sharpened metal implements viable weapons. The universe, it seemed, possessed an excellent sense of irony, and somewhere in the Institute's archives, filed under intercultural educational experiences, a report concluded with the observation that sometimes the most advanced civilizations had the most to learn from the ones they considered primitive. The galaxy's most sophisticated military academy had just discovered that the optimal preparation for the brutal realities of interstellar conflict was instruction from the species that approached every fight like their survival depended on it. Because, as Raven had taught them, it usually did.